How the World Bank trapped Africa in permanent poverty. The colonial debt continues. It was July 1st, 1960. The Republic of Ghana had been independent for just 3 years. Its president, Kwame Nkrumah, stood before his people dressed in the colors of liberation. Cameras flashed, crowds roared. The newspapers called it the African Renaissance. We were told this was freedom. We were told sovereignty had arrived. We were told the chains of colonialism had been broken for good. They had not. The chains were simply being reforged, not from iron, from ink, from loan agreements, from the cold, indifferent language of the balance sheet. The common belief is that Africa remained poor because of corruption, mismanagement, and tribal conflict. Politicians and economists on television repeat this story endlessly. It is comfortable. It places the blame entirely on Africa. But it is a lie of omission. The real story lives in the ledger. It lives in the debt columns of international finance records. It lives in the loan documents signed in wood-paneled rooms in Washington, D.C., while African leaders believed they were being handed a lifeline. They were being handed a noose. This is not a story about war. It is not a story about drought or disease. This is a story about accountants, about creditors, about a single institution that positioned itself as Africa's savior and functioned instead as its jailer. Consider the continent on the eve of independence. Africa held within its borders an almost incomprehensible store of natural wealth. 60% of the world's arable land sat beneath African skies. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone held cobalt deposits worth tens of trillions of dollars. Nigeria's Niger Delta pumped oil that would eventually supply a significant portion of global markets. Gold in Ghana, diamonds in Sierra Leone, uranium in Niger, copper in Zambia. The continent was not poor in resources. It was extraordinarily, almost absurdly rich. The earth beneath African feet contained the raw materials upon which the modern industrial world would be built. And yet the people who lived above all that wealth went to bed hungry. They buried their children from preventable diseases. They walked barefoot to schools with no books, or to no schools at all. Think about the scale of that contradiction. Think about what it means. It does not happen by accident. Beneath the surface of post-colonial celebration, the foundation was already rotting. European powers had spent a century extracting every unit of value they could identify from the continent. They built roads, but only toward ports. They built railways, but only toward mines. Every piece of infrastructure was designed for extraction, not development. When they left deliberately crippled economies behind. African nations inherited borders that made no geographic or cultural sense. They inherited bureaucracies designed for colonial management, not self-governance. They inherited economies built around exporting raw materials at low prices and importing manufactured goods at high ones. The trade relationship was structured from the first day to benefit Europe. It had never been designed otherwise. This was the Africa that walked through the door of international finance in the early 1960s. And waiting behind that door, sitting at a very large desk with a very thick stack of documents, was the World Bank. The World Bank was born in July 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. 44 nations gathered to design the financial architecture of the post-war world. The architects were overwhelmingly American and British. The institutions they created reflected their interests first and the world's needs second. Initially, the bank's purpose was European reconstruction. It helped rebuild war-devastated economies with billions in capital. It worked. Europe recovered. And then, as decolonization swept across Africa in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the bank expanded its gaze southward. The pitch was elegant, almost irresistible. You are a new nation. You need roads, hospitals, dams, factories. You do not have the capital to build them. We do. Borrow from us. Build your infrastructure. Grow your economy. Repay the loans. Simple, logical, civilized. It was, in practice, a trap engineered with the precision of a Swiss watch. Here is where the monster enters the room. Not with fangs, with a briefcase. The loans the World Bank offered were never simple financial transactions. They came loaded with conditions, policy conditions, structural requirements. These were not suggestions whispered politely across a conference table. They were contractual obligations. You signed them, or you got no money. The conditions followed a pattern so consistent, so identical across dozens of countries and decades, that coincidence cannot explain it. Open your markets to foreign competition. Privatize state-owned enterprises. Cut government spending. Eliminate food and agricultural subsidies. Redirect your farmers from growing food for local consumption toward growing export crops, coffee, cocoa, cotton, for global commodity markets. Remove price controls. Think about what these conditions meant for a nation emerging from colonial rule in 1965. Your government is the only institution capable of providing health care, education, and infrastructure to your citizens. The colonial powers left no private sector capable of doing it, and the World Bank tells you to shrink that government. The conditions did not create development. They created dependency. They were a second colonialism delivered not by soldiers, but by spreadsheets. Domestic industries had no chance against foreign competition when markets were forced open overnight. Government services collapsed when budgets were slashed to meet debt repayment schedules. Food security deteriorated as farmers abandoned subsistence crops for export commodities whose prices were set on exchanges in Chicago and London. When global coffee prices dropped in 1986, they dropped by 40% in a single year. The farmers grew more coffee. They earned less cash. Their children went hungrier, but the debt remained. Every dollar borrowed had to be repaid regardless of commodity prices, regardless of drought, regardless of political instability. The ledger did not care. The ledger was indifferent to suffering. The ledger simply compounded. By 1975, Sub-Saharan Africa's total external debt stood at roughly $30 billion. By 1980, it had climbed to $84 billion. By 1987, it had exploded to a staggering $130 billion. Let that number sink in. $130 billion in debt service obligations. Money that should have built schools. Money that should have bought medicine. Money that flowed instead into the accounts of international creditors. The global interest rate shock of 1979 and 1980 was the moment the trap fully closed. The United States Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker raised interest rates to an almost unimaginable 20% to crush American inflation. The effect on developing world debt was catastrophic. African nations had borrowed at variable interest rates. Overnight, their debt service obligations doubled, then tripled. Economies that were already fragile began to shatter. The World Bank and the IMF's answer was the Structural Adjustment Program. From 1980 onward, these programs spread across the continent like a financial epidemic. By 1989, more than 30 African countries were operating under structural adjustment agreements. More than 30 sovereign nations had surrendered meaningful control over their own economic policies to institutions headquartered in Washington, D.C. The requirements were brutal and relentless. Currencies were devalued overnight, sometimes by 50% or more. Ghana's cedi lost almost 70% of its value under its structural adjustment program. Overnight, the savings of ordinary Ghanaians were worth less than half what they had been the previous morning. Price controls were removed. Imported goods flooded markets. Local manufacturers could not compete and simply ceased to exist. State-owned companies were sold, not at fair market value, but at distressed prices to foreign buyers with hard currency, because African buyers had none. Zambia's copper company, the backbone of its national economy, was restructured under IMF direction throughout the 1990s. The process gutted worker protections, slashed wages, and transferred significant operational control to foreign mining interests. The copper still came out of the ground. The profits no longer stayed in Zambia. This was the smoking gun. Not a single document, but a doctrine. The doctrine was called the Washington Consensus, a term coined in 1989 by economist John Williamson. In practice, it was a foreclosure notice served on the developing world. The terms were these: surrender control of your economic policy, open your markets, sell your assets, cut your spending, and we will continue to extend your credit. Refuse, and the credit stops. A senior IMF negotiator, during a 1985 session with Zambian officials, reportedly said the choice was between a painful adjustment now or a catastrophic collapse later. The Zambians signed. The adjustment came. The collapse came anyway, just slower, with the debt still attached. There was another dimension to this story, a quieter theft. Less dramatic, but equally devastating. A substantial portion of World Bank loans to Africa never actually reached African communities in any meaningful form. It was spent as required by loan conditions on equipment, expertise, and services purchased from companies in the lending countries themselves. This practice was called Tide Aid. An American-funded loan for an infrastructure project came with the contractual requirement that American firms be hired to design and build it. A European credit line for agricultural development required European suppliers. The money flowed from the World Bank in Washington to an African government account, and immediately back to corporations in New York, London, and Paris. The debt remained in Africa. The cash did not. A 1992 study estimated that for every dollar lent to Africa under Tide Aid conditions, between 60 and 80 cents flowed directly back to donor country companies. Africa borrowed $1. Africa kept 20 cents. Africa owed $1. It was not development finance. It was a circular extraction operation with a continent as collateral. And then there was the corruption that the World Bank often knew about and continued lending through anyway. The Democratic Republic of Congo under Mobutu Sese Seko is perhaps history's most grotesque example. Mobutu ruled from 1965 to 1997. During those 32 years, he accumulated a personal fortune estimated at between $4 and $15 billion. His citizens starved. His hospitals ran out of medicine. International lenders, including World Bank-affiliated institutions, continued providing credit to Mobutu's government throughout his reign. They knew the loans continued because loans generate debt obligations whether or not the money reaches the people. When Mobutu was finally ousted in 1997, the Congolese people inherited a ruined economy and a debt mountain of approximately $12 billion. They had received almost none of its benefits. They were entirely responsible for its repayment. This is what economists call odious debt, the principle that debts incurred by an illegitimate government without the consent of the population and not used in their interest should not be binding on the nation. The concept has a long history in international law. It has been applied meaningfully exactly once to Iraq's debts after 2003, when Western powers had a political interest in doing so. It has never been systematically applied to African debt. The creditors who would lose money are the same parties who define the rules. By the year 2000, total African debt had reached $340 billion. 33 sub-Saharan African countries spent more money each year on debt service payments than on health care and education combined. More money to foreign creditors than to hospitals. More money to bondholders in London and New York than to children in classrooms. The Jubilee 2000 campaign gathered 24 million signatures demanding debt cancellation. The political pressure became impossible to ignore. In 2005, the G8 nations at Gleneagles in Scotland announced a multilateral debt relief initiative, canceling approximately $40 billion in African debt. It was genuine, it helped. But it came with conditions. Again, debt cancellation was tied to poverty reduction strategy papers, which were, in their essential structure, the same Washington consensus policies repackaged under a kinder name. The language had softened. The architecture had not sovereignty as solvency. When your ability to govern your own country depends on the continued approval of foreign creditors, you are not sovereign. You are a tenant. You live in the house your ancestors built with their labor and their blood, and you pay rent to people who arrived after them and claimed the deed. The aftermath was written into the bodies of children. The UNICEF report of 1987, titled Adjustment with a Human Face, documented what structural adjustment had done to the youngest and most vulnerable Africans. Child mortality increased in countries under structural adjustment. Malnutrition rates rose. School enrollment declined as fees were introduced under privatization mandates. Ghana, often held up as a structural adjustment success story because its GDP numbers eventually improved, saw its per capita healthcare spending fall from $17 in 1980 to $2 by 1989. That is not a typo. From $17 to $2 per person per year. The growth the World Bank celebrated came on the back of a population being systematically denied medicine. Today, African debt is once again approaching the catastrophic. By 2023, sub-Saharan Africa's total external debt exceeded $800 billion. The COVID-19 pandemic between 2020 and 2022 accelerated the crisis dramatically. Government revenues collapsed as lockdowns froze economies. Emergency spending increased simultaneously. Zambia defaulted on its external debt in November 2020, becoming the first African nation to default during the pandemic era. Ethiopia, Ghana, and several others followed into debt distress within 2 years. New creditors had entered the picture by the 2010s. China emerged as a dominant lender, financing roads, railways, ports, and power plants. The debt trap had new architects. The trap remained the continent that holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land cannot reliably feed its own people. The continent that produces 60% of the world's cobalt cannot manufacture a single commercially viable battery. These are not natural conditions. They are engineered outcomes. They are the direct and measurable result of a financial architecture designed to keep raw materials flowing outward and debt flowing inward. The people of Africa are not poor because they are lazy or incapable. That slander has been spoken too many times by people who built their own industrial economies behind massive protective tariffs and enormous state intervention, and then pulled up the ladder. The United States built its manufacturing base behind tariff walls that would be illegal under modern World Bank loan conditions. Germany protected its industries. Japan directed its economy with state power that any African government attempting the same would be denied credit for using. The rules of the game were designed by the winners to stay winners. That is not conspiracy. That is history. That is the ledger showing its numbers plainly to anyone willing to look at them. The chains of colonialism were broken in ceremony and flag-raising and the songs of liberation across a continent that had earned its freedom in blood. And then, quietly, methodically, loan by loan, condition by condition, the chains were replaced. New chains made not of iron, but of compound interest. They were lighter to the touch. They were no less binding. The bankruptcy was not just financial. It was sovereign. It was generational. The debt incurred by colonial administrations, by Cold War-backed dictators, by governments that borrowed under conditions no informed population would have accepted, passed without amendment to the children and grandchildren who followed. They were born into obligations they never consented to. They are servicing debts for infrastructure they cannot use, for projects that failed, for money that was stolen and sits today in Geneva and the Cayman Islands. The final payment on some of the earliest World Bank loans to African nations will not be made for decades yet. The accounting of colonialism has not closed. The balance sheet that opened in the mines and plantations of the 19th century is still being settled in the annual budgets of 21st century African governments. The arithmetic of extraction is patient. It does not hurry. It simply waits and compounds. This is not a comfortable story. It does not end with a solved problem or a hero who fixes everything. It ends here in the present with a continent still bleeding from wounds administered in boardrooms and signed into existence with fountain pens. The ledger is still open. The balance sheet still runs red. What you can do is know. You can understand that poverty is not a mystery. It is a mechanism. It has architects and beneficiaries and a paper trail that runs from 1944 to this morning. History does not happen to people. It is done to them by specific decisions made by specific people, accountable to specific interests. If this is the kind of history that makes you think, the kind that strips the comfortable narrative down to the bone and shows you the metal underneath, then stay with this channel. There are more stories like this one. Stories of nations bankrupted by design. Stories of wealth extracted through the polite machinery of international finance. Every one of them is hiding in plain sight inside the ledger. waiting for someone willing to read the numbers out loud. Subscribe now, because the people who control history are counting on the fact that most people never bother to look at the books.